The courtroom was half empty by 9:47 a.m. Most people had written it off already. A divorce hearing in Columbus, Ohio wasn't exactly appointment viewing. The clerk was on her second coffee. The court reporter was fixing a nail. Even the bailiff near the door had his arms crossed and his eyes somewhere else. Somewhere warmer, probably. Nobody paid much attention to the man sitting alone at the defendant's table. No suit jacket, dark gray work pants, boots with a scuff along the left toe that he hadn't bothered to buff out. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and he didn't fidget. He didn't check his phone. He just looked straight ahead, at the empty judge's bench, like a man who had long since made his peace with something. His name was Ethan Calloway. He was 38 years old. He worked, or had worked because the shop where he'd spent the last 4 years was technically still in his name, as an aircraft mechanic at a small hangar outside Columbus. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150. He paid rent on a 3-bedroom house on Delphus Avenue. He made $62,000 a year. That was all Madison Hartley's attorneys knew about him. That was exactly what Ethan had wanted. 3 years earlier, Ethan had walked into a courthouse for the first time in his adult life, and it wasn't for a divorce. It was to identify the body of his wife. Claire Calloway, née Claire Patterson, born in Dayton on a February morning in 1985, had been driving home from a late shift at Columbus General when a truck ran a red light at the intersection of Broad and Champion. She didn't make it to the hospital. She didn't make it to the phone. She was gone before the ambulance arrived, and the last message she'd sent Ethan was a photo of a vending machine snack. "Dinner. Don't judge me." He still had it. He never deleted it. Their daughter Lily was 4 years old when it happened. Ethan remembered walking back into their house that night. He remembered the babysitter's face when she opened the door. She was 17, a neighbor's kid named Sam, and she knew from his face before he said a word. He remembered stepping over a pair of small pink rubber boots by the door. He remembered going into Lily's room, where she was already asleep, and sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. He didn't cry. Not that night. He made breakfast the next morning. Pancakes, the kind with blueberries, because that was Lily's favorite, and she was 4, and she didn't fully understand yet what gone meant. But she understood pancakes. He kept making them. Every Saturday. For 3 years. That kind of grief doesn't announce itself. It just becomes part of how you move through rooms. The way you pause at the second toothbrush before you remember. The way you start a sentence and then finish it differently. Ethan moved through it. He did the school drop-offs and the dentist appointments and the parent-teacher conferences. He fixed aircraft engines during the week and coached Lily's soccer team on Thursdays. He was quiet about what hurt. He was loud about what mattered. Lily grew, and then Madison came. Madison Hartley was the kind of woman who moved through a room the way a searchlight moves through fog. Bright, deliberate, impossible to ignore. She was 34. She worked in commercial real estate, downtown Columbus, where the square footage numbers came with enough zeros to make lesser people dizzy. She met Ethan at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, a mutual friend's invite, loud music, open bar. He was standing near the window looking at the skyline, and she'd crossed the room to ask what he was looking at. "That tower," he'd said. "Third window from the left, 11th floor. The light's been on since I got here. I've been wondering who's still working." She thought it was an odd thing to notice. She married him 14 months later. She never once questioned the income gap. Or rather, she questioned it exactly once, early on, and Ethan had looked at her steadily and said, "I have enough. Lily and I have what we need." And Madison had interpreted that as either humility or naivete. Either way, she filed it as leverage. Because Madison did not fall in love with Ethan Calloway. She made a calculation. Her attorney, Derek Lawson, 41, corner office in a glass tower on North High Street, silk tie, 2 phones, had laid it out for her at a lunch they were not supposed to be having, at a restaurant 2 miles outside the usual circuit. "He owns nothing," Derek said. "No real assets. The shop is barely profitable. The house is rented. You give this 2 years, establish residency, document shared finances, then we file. Ohio is equitable distribution. You walk with half of everything. The car, the accounts, whatever you can show was marital property." Madison stirred her drink. "And if he fights it?" Derek smiled. "He won't be able to afford to." She had gone home that night, walked past Ethan in the kitchen where he was helping Lily with math homework. 7 times 8 is 56, Lily, count with your fingers if you need to. And she had felt nothing. Not guilt, not hesitation, just the patience of someone following a plan. The marriage lasted 19 months. Madison's attorneys filed in March. By May, they were in Columbus Municipal Court, Family Division, Courtroom 4B, in front of a judge named Avery Monroe. Judge Monroe was 42. She'd been on the bench for 6 years. Before that, 7 years as a public defender, and before that, 3 years clerking for a federal judge in Cincinnati who'd told her, on her last day, that the best thing a judge can do is listen, not perform. Not narrate. Listen. She'd taken that seriously. She was 5'6" with reading glasses she kept perched on her head until she needed them, and she had a way of going very still when she was paying close attention that made younger attorneys nervous. Not because she seemed cold, but because she seemed like she might already know the answer. She'd read both files the night before. She'd eaten takeout at her desk and made notes in the margins in red pen. The facts were plain enough. Madison Hartley Calloway was seeking equitable distribution of marital assets, primary custody of minor child Lily Calloway, age 7, and sole occupancy of the marital residence. Ethan Calloway was self-represented. That last part gave her pause. Most self-represented litigants in divorce cases were either broke or stubborn, sometimes both. She flipped to his financial disclosure, the income, the rent, the modest bank balances, and made one more note. Why isn't he fighting harder? The hearing opened at 9:52. Madison's lead attorney, a sharp-shouldered woman named Patricia Fell, stood and delivered the opening statement with the confidence of someone reading a grocery list. Ethan's financial instability, his lack of real estate holdings, his modest income, she used that word like it was a polite way of saying something worse. The child, Lily, would benefit from stability. Madison was offering a generous visitation schedule. Ethan sat and listened. Judge Monroe watched him. He didn't write anything down. He didn't shift in his chair. When Patricia Fell described his shop as a small operation with uncertain future prospects, the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, just for a moment, and then it stopped. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something closer to patience. When Patricia finished, Judge Monroe looked at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, you've waived representation. Do you have an opening statement?" He stood. He straightened his collar with one hand. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to keep my daughter. That's all I'm here for." He sat back down. Patricia Fell glanced at Derek Lawson in the gallery. Derek gave a small, nearly invisible nod that meant, "Exactly as we expected." Judge Monroe wrote something in red. The day went piece by piece. Madison's team presented bank records, email correspondence, photographs from shared accounts that painted Ethan as uninvested, absent, financially irresponsible. One exhibit was a credit card statement showing a $4,200 charge to a company called Apex Capital Holdings. Patricia Fell presented it as evidence of financial recklessness, money spent on unverified investments without Madison's knowledge. Judge Monroe looked at the statement, then at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, do you want to respond to this exhibit?" Ethan looked at the paper. He nodded slowly. "That charge," he said, "was a quarterly consulting fee. I advised them on a propulsion system's retrofit. They paid me 3 times that. Can you document that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Patricia Fell recovered quickly. She moved to the next exhibit. But Judge Monroe had already noted something. The way he said it, not defensive, not showing off, just factual. The way a person speaks when they have nothing to hide and no reason to perform. The custody testimony came in the afternoon. Madison described Ethan as frequently preoccupied. She said he worked long hours. She said Lily sometimes had to wait at after-school pickup. Once, she said, for 40 minutes. Judge Monroe looked up. Did you call someone? Madison blinked.
Excuse me?
When Lily waited 40 minutes, Judge Monroe said, did you call the school? A neighbor? Mr. Calloway? I was just made aware of it afterward. By whom? By Lily. What did Lily say happened?
Madison shifted.
She said she waited, that he was late. Did she say she was upset? A beat. She said she drew pictures while she waited, but that's... What did she draw? I don't know. Judge Monroe wrote something. She moved on. Later, much later, after the hearing, after the gallery had emptied out and Patricia Fell was rolling her case files to the elevator, Avery Monroe sat in her empty courtroom and looked at her notes. She'd been doing this long enough to recognize certain things. The way a man looks when he is genuinely unafraid of the outcome, not because he's given up, but because he already knows something the room doesn't. Ethan Calloway looked like that. The ruling came 17 days later. Primary custody to Ethan Calloway. Generous visitation to Madison Hartley Calloway. Equitable distribution of documented marital assets, which after full financial disclosure from both parties amounted to a 2021 Honda CR-V and 3 shared bank accounts totaling $31,440. Ethan did not contest Madison's taking all of it. He asked only for Lily and the furniture in Lily's room. Judge Monroe signed the order at 4:22 p.m. on a Thursday. By 5:15, her clerk knocked on her chamber door with an unusual expression. "Judge Monroe," he said, "you might want to see this." He handed her a printed article. The headline read, "Calloway Aerospace Heir Surfaces in Ohio Divorce Case. Ethan Calloway confirmed as sole heir to $14.2 billion aerospace conglomerate." She read the first paragraph, then the second. Then she set the paper flat on her desk and looked at the wall for a moment. Ethan Calloway was not a mechanic. Or rather, he was a mechanic. He genuinely loved the work. He'd spent 4 years doing it on purpose, building something real with his hands, away from boardrooms and press releases and the particular loneliness of being worth more money than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. He was also the only child of Richard Calloway, founder of Calloway Aerospace, who had died 22 months prior. His estate, pending final probate, included a controlling stake in a company that designed propulsion systems for commercial satellites, military contracts, and 3 active NASA programs. The quarterly consulting fee, the apex capital charge. They paid me 3 times that. Avery Monroe sat very still for a long time. Then she opened the divorce file and looked at her ruling. It was correct. She knew it was correct. The facts she'd ruled on were the facts she'd been given, and the ruling she'd made was the ruling the evidence warranted. But she wondered, and she would keep wondering for weeks, what would have happened if she'd been less careful, less curious about the 40 minutes, less interested in the way a quiet man went still when he was paying attention. The story broke on a Friday. By Sunday, it was national. The narrative was almost too clean for the internet to resist. Billionaire heir hides his identity through a divorce, loses almost everything on purpose, wins back his daughter. Every outlet had a different angle. Some were admiring, some were skeptical. A few were already asking harder questions. specifically about Madison Hartley and her attorney Derek Lawson. Because the financial records that Ethan's team released, quietly, precisely, through a Columbus-based law firm that had been on retainer for 8 years and had never once been activated until that Friday, told a different story than Madison's attorneys had presented in court. The $31,440 in shared accounts was accurate. The forged signatures on 2 joint investment disclosures were not. There were 3 wire transfers, totaling $218,000, moved from a business account in Ethan's name into a holding company registered in Delaware that traced back, through 2 shell entities, to Derek Lawson's personal investment portfolio. The transfers had occurred over 11 months. The authorization signatures were Ethan's. The problem was that Ethan had been in Farnborough, England for 2 of the 3 transfer dates, attending an aerospace conference, which his passport and 3 hotel receipts confirmed with precision. He hadn't signed anything. Someone had signed for him. Federal investigators from the Columbus field office were at Derek Lawson's glass tower by Wednesday morning. They took 2 bankers' boxes of files and 3 laptops. Derek arrived at 8:45 a.m. in his silk tie, and he came back out at 11:30 in a different kind of quiet. Madison retained new counsel that afternoon. She made one attempt to reach Ethan directly, a text message from a number he recognized that read, "I think we can still work this out." He read it at 6:03 p.m. while standing at the kitchen counter. He set the phone down. He went back to making dinner. He never replied. The federal case moved quickly by federal case standards. Derek Lawson was charged with wire fraud, identity fraud, and conspiracy. He pleaded not guilty in November. He was convicted in March, 7 months later in the same city, in front of a jury of 12 people who heard the passport records and the wire transfers, and the 2 expert witnesses who confirmed the signature forgeries, and who deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes before coming back with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing, 14 years. Madison was separately charged with conspiracy and financial fraud. She accepted a plea agreement in February, returned $183,000 in restitution, and was sentenced to 3 years of supervised release and prohibited from practicing in real estate brokerage in Ohio for life. Ethan was not in the courtroom for either verdict. He was at Lily's school play. She played a sunflower. She had one line, "The rain comes, and I grow." And she said it so seriously, with such concentrated 8-year-old dignity, that the woman sitting next to Ethan laughed softly, and he turned to look at her. And for a second they were just 2 people sitting in folding chairs in a school gymnasium, watching a child be a sunflower. The woman was Avery Monroe. It had started, if it could be said to start anywhere, in October. Ethan had been walking with Lily through Goodale Park on a Sunday afternoon. They were feeding ducks, which Lily took extremely seriously. She had a system: big pieces to the big ducks, small pieces to the ducks near the edge. She had explained the system to Ethan 3 times. He had agreed it was a good system. He looked up and saw a woman sitting on a bench near the water, with a book open in her lap and reading glasses on her nose. She was not reading. She was watching 2 dogs chase each other in circles near the tree line with the expression of someone who had temporarily solved something. He recognized her. She recognized him at almost the same moment. There was a brief calculation visible on both their faces. The particular discomfort of recognizing someone you've only ever seen in a professional context, and then encountering them somewhere ordinary, wearing regular clothes, with ducks. He nodded. She nodded. He kept walking. He made it approximately 12 steps before Lily said, "Daddy, that lady is watching us." He turned around. Avery Monroe was looking at her book with great concentration. He watched her turn a page she had not read. He turned back to the ducks. Lily pulled his hand. "She looks nice." "She's a judge," he said. Lily considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has no particular opinion about judges. "She still looks nice," she said. They ran into each other twice more before either of them said anything beyond polite acknowledgement. Once at the farmer's market on High Street in November, where Ethan was buying apples and Avery was buying a truly inadvisable quantity of dried herbs. Once outside a coffee shop on Broad Street in early December, where they were both waiting for doors to open at 7:59 a.m. in the cold. That morning she said, "You should appeal." He looked at her. The ruling was fair. The ruling was what the evidence allowed, she said. That's not always the same thing. I know, he said, but I got what I needed. The door opened. They both went in. They ordered separately. They sat at tables that were not near each other. But he thought about that for a long time. The ruling was what the evidence allowed. She had said it without any performance, not fishing for compliments, not flagging her own fairness. She just said it like someone naming a fact they'd already argued with privately and settled. He found that interesting. The second time they talked for real was in January. Lily had fallen asleep during a Christmas concert at the Columbus Museum of Art. The kind of gentle, public falling asleep that happens to small children at evening events. Sudden and complete, like a candle going out. Ethan had been carrying her to the coat check, which required navigating through a crowd with a sleeping 7-year-old over his shoulder, and he'd nearly knocked over a woman holding 2 glasses of wine. The woman was Avery Monroe. She stepped back fast. Neither glass spilled. She looked at Lily's sleeping face and then at Ethan with an expression that contained, in rapid succession, recognition, amusement, and something softer. "She's out," Avery said quietly. "She was out in the first movement," he said. "Smart kid." He adjusted Lily's weight. The piece was Ravel. "I think she had opinions." Avery smiled. It changed her face, not dramatically, not in the way that smiles in movies change faces, just the lines around her eyes deepened, and she looked less like a person at a work event and more like a person who was actually there. "I'll let you get her home," she said. "Yeah." He started to move, then stopped. He turned back. "She drew horses," he said. Avery looked at him. "When she waited for me that day," he said, "you asked Madison what Lily drew. She didn't know, but I do." He shifted Lily's weight. "Lily always draws horses when she's waiting. She has since she was 5. She has a sketchbook in her backpack specifically for that." Avery was very still. "I know," she said carefully. "I know you know," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I know you know." He carried Lily through the crowd and out into the cold January night. They had coffee in February. It was not a date. It was, by mutual unspoken agreement, a thing that was not a date, held at 8:30 a.m. on a Tuesday at a counter-seat coffee shop that neither of them had to go out of their way to reach. They talked for 40 minutes. She told him she'd grown up in Akron. He told her he'd spent 3 years in Seattle after college. She asked how he'd ended up in the hangar, genuinely. And he said the first time he'd held an engine component and understood what it was doing, he'd felt something that he'd never found in a boardroom. She asked if he missed running the company. "I miss the problems," he said. "I don't miss the performance." "What's the difference?" "A problem is real," he said. "Performance is what you put around the problem so other people will watch you solve it." She thought about that. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on the counter. "That's why I almost didn't take this bench," she said. "Why did you?" "My first week on the bench," she said, "I had a custody hearing. Father, 2 kids, 7 and 9. The mother's attorney was very good, very smooth. And I looked at the father's face during the testimony and I thought, he's not scared. And I realized that was strange. Most people in that situation are scared. He wasn't scared because he already knew the truth, and he trusted the truth to do its job." She was quiet for a moment. The ruling went his way, and afterward, in the hallway, his younger daughter, the 7-year-old, she walked up to me and she said, "Thank you for listening." She set down her cup. That was it. That was why. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Lily said you look nice," he said. "Avery," It was a real one, unexpected, short, the kind of laugh that surprises the person doing it. She brought one hand up briefly to her mouth, and her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested they'd been less relaxed than they appeared. "She has good judgment," Avery said. "Terrible taste in music," he said, "but excellent judgment." They texted sometimes after that. Nothing significant at first. A link she'd sent about a propulsion story in the Times, a photo he'd sent of Lily's new drawing, which was in fact a horse. But the texts became longer. The gaps between them became shorter. One night in March, he typed something out and then deleted it and rewrote it 3 times before sending it. "You ever think about what it would look like? A life that's actually what you want?" She didn't reply for 20 minutes. Then, "All the time, I just wasn't sure what I was allowed to want." He read that twice. He put the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling. Something settled in his chest. Not a click, not a thunderbolt. Just the slow, quiet recognition of something that had been true for a while and was only now admitting itself. In April, Avery received a letter. It came on heavy cream letterhead from the office of Senator Patricia Gaines of Ohio. It was 2 pages. It described a nomination to the United States federal bench, 6th Circuit. It described the importance of her record. It described, in careful language, what it would mean for her career. She sat with it for 3 days. She told no one. She made a pro-con list, which she threw away. She made another one, which she also threw away. She drove to Goodale Park on a Saturday morning and sat on a bench near the water, the same bench, and watched the ducks, and thought about the 7-year-old who had said, "Thank you for listening." The federal bench was a different job. More prestige, more power, more distance. Distance from the folding chairs in school gymnasiums, distance from the farmer's market and the 7:59 a.m. coffee shop line. Distance from a man who made pancakes on Saturdays and a girl who drew horses while she waited. She thought about what she'd said to Ethan that Tuesday morning. "I wasn't sure what I was allowed to want." She thought about who had taught her that wanting the wrong things was dangerous. Old voices. Old rooms. The particular silence of being told in 100 small ways that ambition meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant the life in the margins, the personal, the warm, the irreducibly yours. She picked up her phone. She called Senator Gaines' office. She thanked them. She declined. She told Ethan 2 weeks later. They were sitting on his porch on Delphos Avenue at 9 p.m. while Lily was asleep. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, someone was mowing a lawn badly late, the sound coming and going in uneven passes. "A federal nomination," he said. "Yes." "And you said no." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, not processing it. He'd already processed it. She could tell by the steadiness of his face. He was just letting it exist in the air before saying anything about it. "Was it the right call?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "But it was my call." He nodded. He looked at the street. "My father used to say," he said, "that the most dangerous thing a person can do is make someone else's definition of success their own." I didn't understand what he meant until I was 31 and worth more money than I could spend in 4 lifetimes, and standing alone in a kitchen at midnight eating cereal. She turned to look at him. "What changed?" she asked. "Claire," he said simply. And then, losing her. And then Lily's face every morning. He glanced sideways at her. And then, apparently, a judge who asked the right question at the right time. Avery looked at the street for a moment. "What was the right question?" she said. "What did she draw?" The ceremony was in October. Callaway Aerospace broke ground on its new Columbus Technical Center, 62 acres outside the city, a $340 million facility, 500 new jobs, and a research division that 3 universities had already signed partnership agreements with. Ethan had approved the site 18 months prior, from the hangar on the edge of town, in a conference call he'd taken while replacing an engine component with one hand and holding a phone with the other. The afternoon of the ribbon cutting, the sky went gray around 2 o'clock, and by the time the speeches ended and the cameras packed up and the last of the officials filed back to their cars, it was snowing. Light, fine flakes, the first of the season. Ethan stood at the edge of the new building's foundation in his coat. Not the architect's rendering behind him, not the banner with the company logo, not the podium. Just the open ground and the snow coming down soft. Lily appeared beside him. She had been wearing a formal dress that she had agreed to wear under formal protest, and which she had immediately paired with her rain boots, and nobody had said anything because she was 8, and because the boots were yellow, and honestly, she looked great. She tilted her head back and caught a snowflake on her tongue. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. Is this ours now?" "The building will be," he said. She thought about this. "Can I have an office?" "You can have a lab," he said, "when you're older." She considered this upgrade seriously. She nodded. Avery came up beside him. She'd been talking to one of the architects, and she had a small streak of something, ink maybe or concrete dust, on the back of her left hand that she hadn't noticed yet. Her coat was dark blue. Her hair was catching snowflakes and not caring. She stopped next to him and looked out at the open ground. "It's going to be good," she said. "Yeah," he said. Lily reached up and took both their hands. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. She just reached up, one hand to Ethan's, one hand to Avery's, and squeezed once, and then went back to catching snowflakes on her tongue with the focused intensity of a scientist conducting field research. Ethan looked at Avery. Avery looked at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering the new ground clean. He still made pancakes on Saturdays. Blueberry because Lily still preferred them, and also because Claire had preferred them, and because there are some rituals that hold the shape of the people who are gone and the people who are still here, all at once, without contradiction. Avery had started staying on Friday nights, not with announcement, not with ceremony, just gradually, the way a person becomes part of a household. Her reading glasses lived on the kitchen counter now, next to the blueberry jam. Her running shoes were by the door. She had strong opinions about the coffee grinder setting that Lily pretended to find annoying and actually found deeply comforting. On the last Saturday in October, Ethan was at the stove and Avery was at the table reading a brief from a case she was consulting on. She'd taken a position with a legal nonprofit in Columbus, family law, custody cases, the kind of work where the right question at the right time could change the shape of a life. Lily came downstairs in her soccer uniform. She had a game at 10. She sat at the table. She picked up Avery's pen. She opened her sketchbook. She drew a horse, a small one, calm and standing still, in a field with a few careful lines of grass. Then she closed the sketchbook, put the pen back, looked up at Avery. "I'm ready," she said. Avery looked at the closed sketchbook, then at Lily. "Yeah," she said softly. "Me too." Outside, the maple on Delphos Avenue had gone red almost overnight. The street was quiet. A car passed. Somewhere a dog barked once and was quiet again. The smoke came up slow from the chimney. And inside, 3 people sat in the warm yellow light of the kitchen. Not a perfect family, not a found family in the way the phrase gets used, but something more specific than that. 3 people who had each lost something irreplaceable, and who had each found the courage, separately and then together, to let something new be real. The pancakes were almost done. Lily was, something. Nobody rushed anything. If Ethan and Lily's story, and the quiet courage of a judge who chose the right thing over the prestigious thing, meant something to you, drop a comment below. Tell us which moment hit hardest. Was it the 40 minutes?
The snowflakes? The sketchbook?
Stories like this one are made for the people who believe that decency is not weakness, and that the best lives are built slowly, out of ordinary mornings. Like this video if it stayed with you. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we bring you is about the quiet human moments that remind us what actually matters. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room: the faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility. Someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp's stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped.
She hesitates,
Torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide. This story reminds us that truth does not become less true simply because the wrong person speaks it. Marcus lost credibility in society's eyes, but his knowledge, integrity, and purpose never disappeared. Sometimes the world dismisses people not because they are wrong, but because listening to them is inconvenient. The story also shows that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Dr. Thorne looked trustworthy, while Marcus looked suspicious. Yet goodness and evil rarely announce themselves clearly. Real judgment requires patience and humility. Another powerful lesson is that expertise and identity are not the same as social status. Marcus remained a scientist even while pushing a cleaning cart. Titles may disappear, but skill, character, and conviction endure. Finally, the story teaches that redemption and trust are possible. Eleanor learns to dismantle her assumptions, Marcus reclaims his place in the world, and Chloe's survival becomes more than a medical victory. It becomes proof that believing in the overlooked can save lives. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional stories about resilience, justice, and second chances. And tell us in the comments, would you have trusted Marcus in that hospital room? Sometimes one decision changes everything, and your answer might reveal more than you think. This story follows Marcus Webb, a brilliant black toxicologist whose life was destroyed after he tried to expose dangerous research misconduct at a pharmaceutical institute. Once respected as Dr. Marcus Webb, he lost everything: his career, reputation, home, and marriage, after powerful people discredited his findings. Years later, he works quietly as a hospital janitor while raising his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, in a small but carefully organized apartment. Though the world now sees him as invisible, Marcus never stopped being a scientist. At the same hospital, 9-year-old Chloe Sterling, daughter of powerful CEO Eleanor Sterling, lies unconscious with a mysterious illness no doctor can explain. 18 specialists have failed to find a diagnosis. Eleanor, a woman used to controlling every outcome through power and money, watches helplessly as her daughter fades away. While cleaning the hospital at night, Marcus notices something strange outside Chloe's room: the faint chemical scent of DMSO, a compound he recognizes instantly from his toxicology background. His instincts tell him something is terribly wrong. Quietly, he begins observing patterns, documenting dates, tracking medical staff rotations, and recording chemical traces in a notebook. The evidence points toward a horrifying possibility: someone is poisoning Chloe. The more Marcus investigates, the more suspicion centers around Dr. Thorne, Chloe's trusted physician. Thorne appears compassionate, ethical, and devoted, exactly the kind of man no one would question. But Marcus discovers a disturbing connection between Thorne's hospital shifts and Chloe's worsening condition. Behind the scenes, Thorne is secretly involved in a financial conspiracy tied to Sterling Corp stock manipulation, where Chloe's death would trigger massive profits through a carefully timed short sale. Marcus desperately tries to warn Eleanor, but his past and appearance work against him. His PTSD causes his explanation to come out fragmented, and Eleanor sees only an unstable janitor approaching her daughter's room. Security removes him, and he is fired from the hospital for suspicious behavior. Most people would stop there. Marcus does not. Working from a makeshift laboratory beneath his apartment, he uses his remaining scientific skills to create a diagnostic reagent capable of exposing the toxin. Knowing time is running out, he risks everything by returning to the hospital one final night. Inside Chloe's room, Marcus interrupts Thorne just as the doctor prepares another injection. Security tackles Marcus, and once again he looks like the villain. But before being restrained, he asks Eleanor to take a blue vial from his jacket and test the liquid Thorne dropped.
She hesitates.
torn between the trusted doctor and the disgraced janitor. Then she remembers the look Marcus gave her days earlier, not threatening, but urgent. A look of someone trying to stop something terrible. She trusts him. The moment the reagent touches the liquid, it turns deep purple-black, undeniable proof of poisoning. The truth finally surfaces. Police discover financial records and evidence of a massive conspiracy involving Thorne and an investment group seeking profit from Eleanor's tragedy. Chloe survives. The toxin is identified, treatment begins, and her recovery slowly starts. But the greatest healing happens outside the ICU. Eleanor realizes how easily she judged Marcus based on fear, status, and appearances. Instead of offering money or empty apologies, she visits his apartment and begins again, not with power, but with honesty. The story closes with hope. Marcus is restored to the scientific world as director of toxicology at Sterling Corp's new research lab. Yet he keeps his old custodial badge beside his new ID card, a reminder of who he was, what he survived, and the price of being ignored. Nearby sits a photograph of Chloe and Maya laughing together, proof that compassion can bridge worlds adults often divide. This story reminds us that truth does not become less true simply because the wrong person speaks it. Marcus lost credibility in society's eyes, but his knowledge, integrity, and purpose never disappeared. Sometimes the world